It is such a pleasure to be here for this launch of State Department Counterintelligence Leaks, Spies and Lies. And I have the pleasure of introducing Robert. He was born in the U.S., but lived overseas for his first 16 years with his Foreign Service family. He met and was impressed by the many different U.S. government officials that he came across. It was during this time that he decided that he would pursue a career in the government. While at the University of Tennessee, which answered my question about why he has a Southern accent, he majored in political science and minored in French. During his senior year, he forwarded his application for a position as a special agent with the Department of State. It was not until he was halfway through his master's degree, sort of slow response, that the State Department offered him the position. For the next 28 years, he served in both domestic and foreign assignments. For the last 7 years at Diplomatic Security. He served as the Deputy Director of Counterintelligence, followed by 7 years as a consultant to that same office. It was those 14 years, 1995 to 2002, that formed the basis of this terrific book for sale in the back of the room and available for signing afterward by Robert. He looks forward to this evening, as do we all. Thanks.
Well, welcome and good evening. And as a former Washingtonian, I really appreciate the fact that you made the sacrifice to come out here late on a weekend, a weekday night, after a hard day's work, to fight through the traffic, to find the parking spot, to get through the metro, to get here. So I certainly appreciate that. Now, for many of you here tonight, there's an additional sacrifice. You're actually paying to listen to me talk. And for a lot of you who have listened to me talk, you've normally been comforted by a glass of wine, and knowing that when I started to launch into my speech, I would be interrupted within 5 or 6 minutes by some guest, and then you were saved. So for those of you who are doing this, I really appreciate the sacrifice. 2 housekeeping chores, if I may. Having been a government employee for so many years, I'm very used to using acronyms like CIA, DIA, DOD, Department of Defense, IC, which means the intelligence community, a FISA, a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That's the law that allows government investigators to electronically surveil somebody. And so I'm going to do my best to avoid those acronyms, except the ones I just mentioned. If I do use an acronym that I really didn't mean to use, and you bump the person next to you and they don't explain it, you just do this, I'll realize I just used an acronym that you people don't know, and I'll try to do it real quick. The other housekeeping chore is the word black dragon. Now, that's a word we in diplomatic security use to describe those State Department officers who are in senior policy and management positions. Whenever we would encounter a black dragon, that meant you really had to walk very carefully. These are individuals, men and women, who run the State Department. I have known many black dragons. Some are outstanding, some are less so. But from the black dragons that I knew, from Genta Hawkins Holmes to Peter Bergen, they're absolutely outstanding. And in my book, the book, you will encounter both varieties. So that's what a black dragon is. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and I know for most of you know that's very short for me, but I'm going to keep this up here in front of me to remind me of the time. I'm going to break it down into 5 categories. First of all, what I'm going to talk about, what is counterintelligence? Then I'm going to talk about pre-publication review, what it takes to get a book like this published. I'm then going to talk about the motivations of why people do betray their oath of allegiance and their oath of secrecy to the United States, and then I'll open it up to questions and answers. So with that, I'd like to get started. When you talk about counterintelligence, wrong one. When you talk about counterintelligence, I think there's a historical context to counterintelligence, and I think if you go back to the 17th century is where you'll find a basis in it. And the basis is when warring feudal states in Western Europe start to transition to the modern nation state. And I've always been kind of influenced by that 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes when he talks about the Leviathan, the sovereign, the leader of a country, of a new boundary, a boundary that's created and controlled by the sovereign, where the sovereign is responsible for the citizens within his territory, to stop the chaos, to allow modern society to develop. Yet, at the same time while the concept of a sovereign is being developed, you had, and it would be a Frenchman who had come up with this idea, Cardinal Richelieu, who said, secrecy is the first essential of state. So in the 17th century, we have the new concept of a sovereign, and we have a concept that the sovereign must have secrets. In order for the sovereign to protect his citizens or her citizens, sometimes information must be kept. Secrets must be had. And I think George Washington sums it all best in 1777 in writing a letter to Colonel, I have to look at this, Elias Denton, in which he claimed the necessity for procuring good intelligence is apparent, and that we keep the whole matter as secret as possible. Sovereigns and secrets, that's what it is. Secrets are created every day in Washington, D.C., when the Pentagon makes troop movements, when the CIA talks to their spies, when the NSA creates codes or decodes the secrets from other sovereigns, when the FBI conducts investigations. And while these secrets are being created, the sovereign must protect them. And again, I have to go back to George Washington to explain why it's so important. And George Washington also said, there's one evil that I dread, and that is their spies. I think it's a matter of some importance to prevent them from obtaining intelligence on this mission. So from George Washington on, the concept of counterintelligence is really there. So it's important for all of us to start from the same point here. So I need to explain what counterintelligence is and what it's meant to be. It's an unusual discipline, and the sad thing about it is many people can't spell it correctly. Counterintelligence does not have a hyphen in it. And so there are three components to counterintelligence. It's the deterring side, the detecting component, and the neutralizing component. The deterring component of counterintelligence starts when a person applies for a position with the government that requires a top secret clearance. He or she then submits their background information about themselves. That agency will conduct a full field background investigation to assure that the person that will be granted a top secret clearance is suitable to handle that kind of information. When that person then does get a job with the State Department, I'm going to keep State Department specific, they sign what's called a security acknowledgement form. And I'll get back to this a little bit later because it's very important when we start doing our investigations. You sign the document, you come aboard, you get a briefing about the capabilities of hostile intelligence services. You get a briefing about your own personal vulnerabilities. You are taught to recognize when you may be targeted by an intelligence service. I'm not using friendly services or enemy services. It's all intelligence services. All intelligence services around the world are trying to steal our secrets. And to digress just a little bit here, last month, the deputy director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, came to talk to Dartmouth College. And he came to talk to a class that I'm attending, a seminar class I'm talking about anything we students or attendees wanted to ask him. And one of the students asked Mr. Morrell, he said, Mr. Morrell, what's the primary job of the CIA? And he said, to steal secrets. And I was kind of taken aback by his candor. But what he was explaining at that time is while the CIA's primary job is to steal the other sovereign secrets, the other sovereigns are trying to steal ours. So we remind our employees that they will be targeted by intelligence services. And during the course of their career, especially those who go overseas, I have briefed these officers to remind them of the capabilities of these intelligence services, but also to remind them they can be vulnerable for personal reasons. The detecting component of counterintelligence is normally conducted by the NSA and the CIA. And what that is the NSA intercepts coded messages or plain text messages, deciphers them, tries to make sense out of them, and then passes it along to those intelligence agencies, normally the FBI, in order to see whether there's sufficient information to begin a counter-espionage investigation. The CIA, on the other hand, normally gets human assets. They debrief, and from those debriefings, they may get hints that we may have a vulnerability somewhere within the US government. Now, the neutralizing aspect of counterintelligence, and it's not as sexy as it sounds. I just saw Bronson, James Bond, driving with his right hand, shooting out with his left hand. That is not counterintelligence. Counterintelligence, and I see some very knowing, shaking heads in here, really, in fact, is pretty boring. It involves a lot of interviewing people who are 60, 70, 80 years old, trying to jog a nugget of memory that happened 20 years before. It's going and looking at some files that are over 30 years old. You open them up, they're crumbling in your hand. We're trying to match up information in the files and the interviews that matches up to the NSA intercepts or the CIA debriefings. If there is sufficient information developed from all of that, then the FBI will most likely open a counterintelligence inquiry, and they'll start gathering more and more information. Now, some of you may say, why the FBI? My response is, why not? For me, these are very complicated, complex, resource-managed issues. Most of the small agencies do not have the resources to do this. Now, we have some knowledge. But the Intelligence Authorization Act of 1995, Section 811, mandates that any intelligence agency, any government agency that suspects that one of their employees is in fact an asset of a foreign intelligence service, or that their information is being compromised, they must refer it to the FBI under an 811 referral. If the FBI believes the information is sufficient, they say, we're taking it over, because the FBI can. And I say with all due respect, my FBI colleagues, and you know who you are. But I've enjoyed working with my FBI colleagues. I never had an issue with that. They always kept us informed, 89% of the time. And we have been extraordinarily successful, in which the book will talk about that and demonstrate to you. And so, when we begin a counter-espionage investigation, it's because there is a belief that there has been a deliberate or inadvertent compromise of classified information. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a spy, because a deliberate or inadvertent loss of information could also be what we commonly call an unauthorized disclosure, and those are leak cases. And I discuss that in detail in part 3 of the book. This is a great story. I couldn't wait to tell it. I found that working with my colleagues in the FBI was exhilarating. And I mean that. I enjoyed working with them, so much so that my boss, John Tello, who's actually in the back seat tonight, got very worried that I was an asset of the FBI working in the Office of Counterintelligence. And I spent so much time over there that he said, he got very nervous about it, but he eventually accepted the fact that I enjoyed what I did. That kind of brought me to a stumbling block, because I had talked about writing this book, and in fact, I gave a presentation here at the Spy Museum, about 3 years ago, and it was all about part 1. It was an hour-and-a-half presentation that I gave, And at the end of it, Amanda Ohlke was so kind. She says, Robert, that's a great story you're telling. Where's your book? And so I kind of walked out and said, Robert, you know, if you ever write your book, we will debut it here at the International Spy Museum. Oh, God, okay. 7 days later, I'm up on Wisconsin Avenue behind the Whole Foods, and I'm walking back to my house. And who do I run into in the street? Amanda. So we start talking, and she reinforced to me the idea that you write this book, I guarantee you we'll do it here. So part of the emphasis and reason why I'm here tonight, in fact, is because of Amanda and her insistence on you do it, I'll get it out. Now, a lot of you here have heard me talk about this book for 14 plus years. It's here. So, but sentence 5 of that security acknowledgement form that you all sign, all government employees sign before you join the State Department, let me just read it to you. It's only one sentence long. I hereby assign to the United States government any royalties, remunerations, emoluments that have been resulted of any result of my disclosure, publication, or revelation of classified information not consistent with the terms of this agreement. Now, just last month in the Washington Post, it seems as though the former director of the CIA, Mr. Leon Panetta, in his new book, did not follow that. And he has a little issues about giving his manuscript, the Penguin Books, before it was cleared. And also, 2 weeks ago, it appears as though the SEAL member, Mr. Bissonnette, actually may suffer criminal prosecution for having written about his time with the SEALs without having gotten it cleared. I, on the other hand, being a good soldier, marched my manuscript down to pre-publication review at the State Department. It's also called Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. There's another acronym, so I got that out. And it was with pure luck that FOIA actually has their offices 5 floors below mine over in Roslyn, Virginia. So I finally get a phone call. Linda, that's her real name. You're not going to get her last name. Linda says, I've got your manuscript. I'll get back to you in a couple weeks. Because the rule is, if they don't get back to you in 90 days, you get to publish. On the 89th day, 23rd hour, 59th minute, I get a phone call from Linda. Says, Robert, can you come on down? I want to talk about your manuscript. I said, fine. So I come on down. I'm waiting, and she walks out with the manuscript. It's got more stickies and postums. And it looks like a Christmas tree. What is this? So I sit down, and Linda says, Robert, we've got a problem with your book. And I said, I know there's no classified in the book. I'm not that stupid. I mean, I was in counterintelligence for almost 14 years. I kind of get it. And so she says, well, I'm going to talk to her. She puts it down, she opens the first page. She goes, Robert, right here, you have Kendall Myers and Don Kaiser's. They're the two people in part 1 and part 2. She says, you have their date and place of birth. I go, yeah? She goes, well, that's protected by the Freedom of Information Act. I go, no, it's in their public indictment. When they were arrested, they were identified by their date and place of birth. She kind of looks at me and says, well, Robert, I got another problem. You actually describe Kendall's divorce and Kaiser's divorce. That's protected. I said, no, you go to the Baltimore courthouse and divorce records are public record. They are available to anybody, you know, who wants to spend the time reading those darn things. He says, well, you talk about the fact that that Kendall was arrested for growing marijuana and processing marijuana in his home up in North Dakota. That's an arrest record. I said, Linda, it's on LexisNexis. I said, you can go and actually find the sheriff's name. Sheriff Volmer, the guy who kicked down the door, there's his name, there's the whole thing. And then it dawned on me what was going on here. Just because the government collects the file on you, when I talked about doing your initial investigation, your update investigation, we get all sorts of information about you. It's your date and place of birth, it's where you went to college, it's the references. I always like to interview the old girlfriend or boyfriend. They were the greatest sources of information. But that file is in fact restricted. It is classified. And had I taken that file out and given it to somebody, yes, I'd have violated the rules. So I said, Linda, has your office ever done a pre-publication review on a book like this? She goes, well, no, we never really have. And I said, well, I think we're going to have some issues here because this is simply not working. So what are the problems you have? I said, Robert, in part 4 of your book, you mentioned the fact, you mentioned DS agents by names in your part 4. I said, Linda, in a publication that I wrote 10 years ago that's freely available called the DS Update, there's the names of John Trogdon, there's the names of Ollie Ellison, all the agents' names are publicly available. And she looks at it, she goes, oh, gee, God, well. I said, Linda, I'm getting a little nervous here about pre-publication review. It really doesn't seem you're doing what you need to do. I said, well, I have another problem with your book, Robert. Also in part 4, you identify the conference room in which the Russian listening device was found on the 7th floor of State. She said, you identified the Office of Oceanic Environment and Scientific Affairs, and we want to redact that. I said, Linda, 8 months ago, in a publication by the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, which obviously your office signed off on page 361, you identified the Office of Oceanic, Environmental, and Scientific Affairs. I said, I'm getting some inconsistent vibes here. I'm not comfortable with whether you people are redacting. So she said, well, so I take a tweak at pre-publication review. When you go to my book and you look on page 281, I had indicated many years ago that the Office of Counterintelligence suffered some cutbacks. The Black Dragons had decided that we didn't need counterintelligence anymore because Russia didn't exist. They're gone. Putin's gone. Russia's great. No problem. And that reinventing the government, we'd have to spend money other ways. So we're going to cut positions and money to the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. So I wrote the numbers out, the total number of losses of men and women, and the total loss in finances. And they said, got to redact that. And I'm saying, that's not classified. It's simply not classified. It's not what we're redacting. Luckily for me, or should I say luckily for my wife, she finds a 1999 testimony in front of Congress done by Assistant Secretary of State Dave Carpenter. He was asked by the Senate, why is it the Office of Counterintelligence seems to be suffering from problems? And Dave Carpenter says, because in 1995, they were cut their positions from 41 to 26, and their budget went from $250,000 to $65,000. So on one side of 281, it's redacted, but on 282, I give the public testimony saying the same thing. So I had real difficulties with pre-publication review because I wanted to tell a real story here. I wanted to make sure that we all understand that, oh God, it's coming up, that I can't tell this story without getting into some of the specifics. And the last one I want to say before I go forward on this one, I indicate the fact that my CIA colleagues actually work overseas, and they work under some kinds of cover. And she said, Robert, you can't do that. I said, I can't? She said, no, you can't say CIA work under cover overseas. I said, well, I said, Linda, that's amazing because in a book published by Dick Holm, he said, I was the former station chief in Belgium, and in France. And I know that. He was there with me in France. So he publishes a book that says, I did it, but I can't say that. Then Jim Lilly, the former CIA employee, who was unfortunately outed by Jack Anderson, the Washington Merry-Go-Round, many years ago, he writes a book called China Hands. And in it he says, I was the undercover CIA station chief at the United States Liaison Office in Beijing, China. But I can't say that. So I'm here to confirm for you tonight, despite what I thought for 37 years, the CIA does not assign their officers overseas under any kind of cover. And when Mike Morrell, at the same seminar that I was at said that he assigns his officers overseas, I was kind of taken aback because I went up to him after the class. We had a nice long talk. He's a very nice guy, and I can see why he commands loyalty. He's a really interesting and wonderful guy. And I said, you know, Mike, what you just said in class, your pre-publication review people, the CIA, said, you got to take it out. He goes, oh my God. He said, how do you think I can do with my book? I said, well, Mike, good luck with yours. I know what they did with me. So that's the way that one goes. So any case, enough of that. I know you want to talk more about the book. So one thing that kind of comes up a lot is why do government employees betray their oath of secrecy? And this is an acronym that's coined by the FBI going back many, many years, but it's really much more complicated than that. This is kind of a short form version for most of us who do not get involved in this. If you are involved in this sort of stuff, it really is much more complicated than that. And, the first reason why we have found that most people spy is they spy for money. They're just flat out greedy. And when you talk about the CIA spies, be it Aldrich Ames, be it Nicholson, or the FBI spies, Pitts or Hansen, they did it all for money. Walker, who just passed away, the Navy guy, spying for the Russians, did it all for money. He actually recruited members of his family to be a spy. Can I understand money? Is it a real good reason? I don't think it's a real good reason, but I can understand why people with vulnerabilities would go ahead. You offer, Hansen. I'll just make a quick shout out here into the audience. David, how much did he compromise? David Majors, who I work with for you. David, how much money did he make?
He made about $600,000, and he's compromised over $2 billion.
So, I mean, these are the kind of things that, you're just staggered. I mean, how can you betray your country? It's a good thing. So the anti-secret stealers, I mean, we have a tough job to do because inside the counter-espionage bureaus, we got our own betrayers. So it makes it even more difficult. The one that I found most fascinating in trying to understand the motivations of why people would compromise classified information is from the ideological point of view. Now, a lot of people say, no one would spy for the bad guys. That's really kind of nuts. But in reality, when you look at those State Department employees who were investigated for espionage, not necessarily convicted of it, you start with Alger Hiss, Michael Straight, Mr. Lieber, Geneva Jones, Don Kaiser, Kendall Myers. They never took a dime. They provided information to an intelligence services for a variety of beliefs. The initial ones, Alger Hiss and Michael Straight, they were seduced by communism. Geneva Jones provided information to the Liberian Intelligence Service. I didn't even know they had one. Because she believed that the United States was not doing enough for the West African country. Stephen Lalas, Greek heritage, was recruited by the Greek Intelligence Service. And Kendall, I'll talk a bit more about the Cubans. And the most fascinating thing about the State Department compromisers, everyone had been recruited by a foreign intelligence service before they joined the State Department. Today's background investigations, I hate to say it, are not going to uncover a spy. And certainly not at State, because we don't give polygraphs. And I'm not going down that road about polygraphs. Not what this one's, no. So we have issues at State. They join State for the purpose of spying. They're not recruited once they're at State, which I find, well, the ones we've caught. And people say, Robert, what percentage of spies do we catch? I'm going to be very open about this, and I'm going to say maybe 5%. 95% of spies get away. And the reason why they get away? Because they're good. They're not sloppy. They're not bad. They may be boring. They may be dull. They may be burrowed in deep. but we're not going to catch them. Only 5%. And in part 4, I identify one person who got away and identify her by name and identify where she be found today and what country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, among others who got away. C stands for compromise. Now, normally in the past, compromise meant that a State Department officer was caught in a compromising position. It normally meant sex with a person, not their spouse, and that the intelligence service had a video of it, had pictures of it, went up to the officer and said, we got these pictures of you, and unless you provide information to us, we're going to blab it to your boss, and you'd be fired, you'd be humiliated, we'll put it in the press. And this was the case of one State Department officer by the name of Irving Scarbeck back in the 50s. He was compromised in Poland. But today, I use compromise more as a leak investigation. And this is where State Department officers deliberately provide classified information to the press in order to influence events. They want to change the course of history. They're dissatisfied with what the State Department policy is, and they wish to change it. They're still guilty of unauthorized disclosure of classified, but they don't come to the level of espionage. But what's important is there are different categories, and when you read part 3 of the book, you really understand how complicated unauthorized disclosures are. They may start off at espionage, and they may go all the way back down to unauthorized disclosures. And finally, ego. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I always get a big kick out of this. Every time we catch somebody and they're being prosecuted for a conspiracy to commit espionage, the psychologists say, God, we can't wait to get a hold of this guy or gal. We got to debrief him. We got to find out why they spy. And for those of us who do the investigations, we could care less. Anything you do, the guy's a narcissist or she has ego. How do you investigate narcissism? Frankly, to be good in the State Department in any category, you got to have a bit of a healthy ego. The humble may inherit the earth, but the egotists own it now. The very self-assurance that the common denominator of all men and women of achievement will rub the humble and the self-effacing the wrong way. So, ego, and I would argue that all the people that I have looked at or investigated, and ones we investigated but let go, has a combination of this. So that's why it's a very complicated matter. And it's something very tough to do. So, as I mentioned earlier, the foreign intelligence services are working in Washington, D.C. primarily. They're here under journalistic cover. They're here under diplomatic cover. They're here under business cover. They're trying to develop relationships with State Department officers on the up and up. And they're going to talk. They're going to develop these relationships. And information is shared. That's exactly what happens in Washington, D.C., and certainly among the diplomats and members of the intelligence community. And that's why we always have to be on the lookout. And that's what led me to the final business here of the 4 parts of the book. Now, I'm going to spend about another 10 minutes, and then I'm going to open up the Q&As, because I'm running against my 45-minute time, and I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask questions if you can. At the top, you're right, that's Don Kaiser. He's the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And I'd actually worked with Don in Beijing, China in 76 and 77. He has a healthy ego, but I like Don. I think Don was an excellent officer. He's a China specialist. He's someone I could work with. I worked with him 2 more times before. And in the book, you'll read about my relations with Don. I thought he was a fine guy. Imagine how stunned I was when the FBI comes to us and says, do you realize that Don seems to be in a clandestine relationship with a female Taiwanese intelligence officer, not his wife? That's kind of a clue. Kendall Myers, Kendall is fascinating. He's the great-great-grandson of Alexander Graham Bell. He's a fascinating, I know I interviewed him in prison. Over 18 hours worth of video exists just to protect me. My wife made sure she saw it to make sure there's nothing I said in my book that'd get me in trouble. Kendall went to Brown University, a hotbed of radicalism, I guess, back in the 60s. And as he told me while he was at Brown, that he became disillusioned with the government. He saw what was happening in the South. He saw what was happening in Vietnam. And at that point, he said, I need to do something to help the peoples of the world. The great-grandson of Alexander Graham Bell. And as he explained it to me, he went to the Army, served in the Army in signals intelligence, understood how we intercepted Czech communications while he was serving in Germany, came back with the Johns Hopkins University, finished up his PhD, and at that time decided he would become a hostile intelligence asset of some foreign intelligence agency that he thought he could help. And he said he looked at the East Germans, and I love the word he uses, I found them too brittle as a country. But he eventually said that, you know, Cuba, that was a real revolution. Castro was not a commie. And they only became a commie because of what we Americans did. And then we invaded them in '61, and they threw us out, so we got to keep Cuba pure. So I am going to become an intelligence agent for the Cuban intelligence service. And he went about in his own way and fashion of making himself available to the Cubans to be recruited, which is exactly what he did. I don't want to bore you all here. You got to read it and get bored. So the bottom portion down there is one of the most fascinating cases that I did. And what I want to do is I have this opportunity because when you read this book and you go to part 1 and you read about Kendall Myers, the case was really going nowhere. And there's a lot of bureaucratic reasons for that. And the case had been floundering in the FBI for a long time. And DS people were working with the FBI. We thought that information that had been gathered by the intelligence community suggested that the person known as Agent 202 was in fact State Department. But because of bureaucratic law regulations, because I don't have a polygraph, I cannot see the crown jewels of the intelligence community. But working in my office was a young FBI special agent by the name of Kate Alleman. And Kate Alleman decided that the rules had to be bent a bit because she saw the information that she knew I couldn't see, but she knew that only I and Bill Stowell were two people who could read that same information and make sense of it. And Kate is with us tonight. And had Kate not allowed Bill and I to go over and read those files, Kendall would have got away. Kate, do you mind standing up for a second so the audience, she won't. So if this case is because of Kate. And then Bill and I spent weeks and months later until we identified who we thought was Agent 202. The leak cases I'm not going to get into. They're very short. They're very different. And the funny thing about the leak cases, what you're going to read are specific cases of inadvertent compromises of classified information. When a State Department officer leaves a briefcase inside the Chinese mission in New York and then doesn't tell us about it, that's inadvertent, but it's not smart. And on the other hand, you will have other cases in Part 3 which you will hear State Department officers deliberately providing information to newspapers and other because they just felt they wanted to do it. And the final thing I'll mention right here on the fact how the Russians got a listening device into the 7th floor of the State Department. Again, it was the good work of the FBI and their special teams that roam Washington, D.C., looking for those kinds of counterintelligence anomalies that can be analyzed and turned over to the investigators when they believe something has happened. And it was a great case in the fact the Bureau and the CIA and diplomatic security worked well and hard on it. At the conclusion of it, There was a CI award given out at Langley. It's in the epilogue. And the case was called Sacred Ibis. And George Tenet talked about the fact it's the kinds of case that shows that we can work across the lines. The CIA and the FBI and diplomatic security can work together, just like Kate Alleman did in solving Part 1. So with that, I see I've almost done my 45 minutes, and that's about, because there's no wine here to comfort you, I'll kind of wrap this up real quick. First thing I want to make absolutely sure here is that this is my point of view. I do not represent the State Department. Everything I've said here to mine is strictly mine. Okay? I enjoyed my career with the State Department. I wouldn't give it up for anything. It's something I really enjoyed. And in fact, I worked hard with some of the Dartmouth students today trying to convince them not to do hedge funds, not to work in finance, but would a couple of you please consider public service? I think working for the government, which is what I did when I thought about when I was in college, was honorable. It still is. We need good men and women to still serve, and so that's what I do. And on that final note, I'd like to say I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you very much for 40 minutes. Please bear with me. I know, I'm sorry there's no wine. But I'm going to read something here because it is kind of one of the more interesting cases that I had to do. Real quick, when I was a young special agent, one of the first conundrums I had to resolve was a case where top secret documents were being shared among convicted felons in a federal institution near Washington, D.C. In this instance, the department thanked God that interest in foreign policy was not particularly high among the inmate population. Unlike comic books, drugs, and shanks, which could be easily traded for favors or contraband, the classified department documents held little value to the run-of-the-mill miscreant. Put another way, bureaucratic prose of a highly sensitive nature was not the currency of the prison. Not surprisingly, the office eventually identified as being responsible for losing the classified information was none other than the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. The loss of highly classified information received the first public exposure when a Washington Times article dated November 10, 1983, entitled, "Secretary Schultz Orders Hunt for Person Who Let Secret Papers Go to Jail." Schultz, who was informed of the situation during a refueling stop in Alaska while traveling to Japan, had ordered an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the loss of our government's most sensitive information. It was another black eye for the department, one that caused much snickering and finger-pointing among the Washington pundits and politicos. 7 days before the Washington Post article appeared, I was sitting behind my massive oak desk, poring over unsolved investigations when my phone rang. "Special Agent Booth," I answered, "Special Investigations Branch, Department of State. How may I help you?" God, I remember those phone calls answers. On the other end of the line, "I'm Correction Officer Charles Rice at Lorton Reformatory. I've been calling everybody in federal enforcement, and no one seems to be willing to help." Lorton Reformatory. That would be the District of Columbia's severely overcrowded and outdated prison built in Occoquan, Virginia, which holds D.C.'s most violent and vicious criminals. Nothing but nothing good happens there. No wonder no one wanted to talk to C.O. Rice. "Well then," I said, "why don't you tell me your story and let's determine who should be talking to you." "Listen," he said, "a month ago I found these government documents in an old metal file cabinet being refurbished by Lorton inmates." "Oh, really?" I said. "Yeah, and when I told my Lorton supervisor about it, he told me to forget it. And when I called the FBI's Alexandria field office and talked to Jerry..." Now, this is an interesting point. The FBI was very good when I sent it to the pre-publication review people. But here's what they said. They allowed me to publish all this stuff. They said, "You can't name active FBI agents." And I said, "But I turn on the TV at night. You got FBI agent Sack of the White, you got Frank Montoya here, you got this person there." And they said, "Yeah, but Robert, you can't do it." So, because Kate Alleman is retired, she's in it. But, to my FBI colleagues, if you read it carefully and you look at the acknowledgments, I'm acknowledging you and you know who you are. So he said that, "Oh yeah," and then I called Sally at the Department of Justice, And she claimed that she had no jurisdiction, and that's why I'm calling you. He says to me, and I said, oh God, I thought, I got a real loony on the end of this line. He's calling everybody to come down to me. And he said, but I think these papers are State Department papers. Some papers have State Department telegram written on the top. And I have one in my hand right now. To myself, I said, oh boy, I think I might have a problem here. I said, can you start to read from the top of the cable? So Rice starts to recite from the top, and he starts announcing State Department acronyms and date groups entirely consistent with State Department cables. I interrupted him asking, is there a large marking in the middle, on the top and bottom of the page? Yeah, he replied, secret. And I said, any words on the subject line? And he goes, yeah, Grenada. But I think the cable you'd be most interested in is the one that talks about a suspected KGB agent traveling in Austria. And I'm going, oh boy. And I said to myself, someone is going to die here. Excellent. You have reached the right office. I quickly asked him if he could drop by my office the next day for an interview. At 3:45 the next day, Officer Rice steps in my room. I start having a long conversation with him. He talks about what's going on. He talks about how he went into the prison, how he found things, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And then he says, oh, by the way, someone came by from the State Department to pick up the documents. And I said, so how did you know? He said, well, he just came by and he picked them up and that was it. And I'm saying, so State Department, and no one's telling my office about it? I got a problem here. And so I immediately reported to my boss, Ben Schomburg. I said, we got a real problem here. Documents are found down there. He tried to alert people to it. And that somebody from State Department came down and picked them up, and we haven't been able to do a damage assessment because no one's told my office, and I did the damage assessments at the time, what we had to do. So I said, Officer Rice, we're going to open an investigation. Do you want confidentiality in this matter? He goes, absolutely, I want confidentiality in this matter. So I write it up, I send the report to Ben Schomburg. And so I go home. Imagine my shock after getting home that night around 7:30 and turned on the television, and a reporter announced, tonight, exclusive on WTTG5, we talked to a Lorton Reformatory official who says he found classified documents inside the prison. I'm going, someone's going to die here tonight. At 11 o'clock on Channel 5's lead story, started off, and there's C.O. Rice, the guy who just asked for confidentiality 8 hours ago. He's sitting with a WTTG5 reporter, and he says, right outside the diplomatic entrance of the State Department. And so Rice starts off the comment saying, just a few minutes ago, I was inside talking to Special Agent Booth and Mike Considine. And that's when my phone started to ring. Thank you. I'll take questions. Oh, Kevin asked a question. You said you had guys in the office who want to ask questions. You said you'd keep them good. I'm sorry, Mr. Teicher, please.
So, Robert, in the course of your career, 2 leak questions for you. Number one, given the importance of leaks to this town getting things done, how often did you find yourself in a situation where you conducted a leak investigation and it might have led you to a path where the leak investigation was prematurely ended because the leak was really involving policy? The second one was, based on some of my experience, did you ever find yourself in a situation where you were looking to see who was leaking information to other government agencies that the State Department might not have wanted shared?
Good questions. I can answer the first one because in part 1 and part 3 of the book, I actually talk about the fact the only time I really knew there was a leak of classified information that happened that was not approved was when a black dragon called my office and said, there's been a leak. I read the newspaper all the time. I see sensitive stuff in there. I see anonymous senior State Department officials said this, and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, God, that's kind of sensitive. But what I really learned from that is that 85% of so-called leaks to the press are authorized. It's an attempt by the administration to run a flag up the pole and see who will salute it. And therefore, the real number of unauthorized disclosure investigations are relatively small, so yeah, there just weren't that many. And only a black dragon can tell me if it's a leak. I don't know. I'm not a policy guy. On leaking to other government agencies, not whistleblowing. I never was involved in an inquiry or an investigation in which a State Department officer was accused of sharing information with another agency without their consent. I have heard, on the other hand, of some very powerful intelligence agencies very upset and annoyed with their employees for sharing information with State Department. That's for sure, absolutely. Yes, Andy? Andy and I went to high school together, Bethesda Chevy Chase High School in the late 60s, so I appreciate him coming in on a long night like this. Thank you, Andy.
And he graduated far ahead of me in the class. Given the Snowden case and the naval yard shooter case, how much can we count on background investigations as a way of protecting both information and even personal safety?
I don't have any more information than you do about the Snowden case at this point. As I mentioned earlier, that a background investigation that's first conducted on an applicant trying to gain access to classified information, I think they're a bit outdated. I think we're kind of looking at the things that we used to do in the 50s and 60s to try to find people that have not been updated. The thing for State Department, this is something they have to consider. Are we going to now insist on polygraph examinations? Now, that doesn't mean after let's say you are a perfect candidate. Let's say then 5 years later you get an update and you're a perfect candidate. Let's say 2 years after that last update, you suffer a financial, a human crisis, a psychological crisis, and you hide it in the office, you show no manifestations of it, and then you finally crack, like remember the postal workers of years ago, they just finally come in, you just hate your boss. I mean, I'm trying to better understand this case where these two lawyers just stabbed the guy up here, and it's in today's Metro section of the Washington Post. One worked in the Adjutant General's office for the Army. You can't predict that, and I don't think we can you're talking about more violence, and in my book, I talk about the Carol Doster case. She was killed in the State Department on the 7th floor by her son. So I'm not sure we could always probably do a better job, but unless we make it a fortress. And remember, where classified information is processed, it is protected by gates, guards, and guns. You gotta have special ID cards. You gotta go through doors that are reinforced, and you have to have ID cards to get in there. But if someone really wants to hurt, I think they're gonna be able to because they're very trusting. And if you show up every day for 8 years and you're a great guy and you snap on the 5th day, I don't know how we can predict it. I really don't. Charlie Chase, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Robert. Robert, of all the cases you worked in with DS, which case you think did the most damage to national security at State Department? Which case you could recall?
Oh, it's no question. It's Kendall Myers. Kendall Myers, what he did, Anna Montez, at the same time he was spying for State Department, Anna Montez was spying for the Cubans at DIA. And what Kendall allowed Castro to do for all those years that he was supplying them with information, Castro was able to check and stalemate all our diplomatic initiatives. I mean, I don't think Castro really cared whether the 101st went on alert in Miami, except this recent revelation in the Washington Post that in 1975, Henry Kissinger was considering invading Cuba. I noticed that Kissinger would not comment. But Castro's greatest fear, Charlie, I think, was diplomatic initiatives, humanitarian aid, reunification of families, medical, the kind of things that might have gotten the Cuban people to reconsider their loyalty to Castro. So anything the American government tried to do, he knew about it ahead of time, he knew what to say. But suppose we asked Peru or Mexico to quietly carry a diplomatic initiative for us so that it didn't be so harmful. Castro knew the Mexicans were doing it, so it was out of the way. And Kendall did, by revealing some information to the Cubans, he compromised technical collection assets. So those things were shut down. So that cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, besides compromising all our diplomatic initiative. No question of the ones we caught.
Right. And Robert, and what service you think did the most damage to the State Department, target us the most? Would you say the Cubans or the...
No, I'd have to say the SVR. I think they were very successful both overseas and domestically in the United States and able to recruit not only state but others. But that's my experience. I mean, I had my 14 years at the end. Some people might say the Ministry for State Security in China is very, very effective. But I just really can't say. But of the cases I did and was involved in, but then again, when I mentioned, Stephen Lawless was spying for the Greeks, and Don was providing information to the Taiwanese. So those are bits and pieces. I'd have to say the Russian intelligence service, former KGB, now known as SVR.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Hi. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little on your instinct as to what would be a better predictor of vulnerability. Ben said polys. I'm wondering why, if you could elaborate on that, or what else would predict problematic behavior.
Again, Jonathan J. Pollard, spying for a friend, the Israeli intelligence service, came to our attention because one of his co-workers was willing enough to come to his security officer and say, Jonathan J. Pollard is exhibiting some bizarre behavior. He's an Asian specialist, and he's asking for information about Israel. So it took a security-conscious colleague to be willing to go to the security officer and say, there's a problem here. How many of you here in this room would be willing to go to your human resources officer and say, I think Sally next door is a psycho. Or I think she's living beyond her means. Or I think she drinks too much. People who have vulnerabilities, they're normally pretty visible, but we're not a tattletale society. So we're very reluctant to go to those individuals who are responsible for watching that. It's just the nature of who we are. Besides a polygraph, I'll be honest with you, I don't think there's a tool in the bag that we have left, especially given, and I'm not blaming the American Civil Liberties Union, but given a number of organizations out there who really believe the government is way too intrusive. They now don't want you to indicate on your application forms that you have an arrest record. What? I mean, if you're applying for a job in the State Department, I want to know, would you hire somebody that had a conviction for negligent homicide? He did. Kendall Myers was convicted of negligent homicide before he joined the State Department. You can read how exactly he overcame the background investigation process. I don't know. I do not have an answer. I'm sorry. Unless we start going to people's homes and again, and one quick thing of that, if you talk to a psychiatrist, that's privileged information. The State Department may not be able to get it. And then we send our medical team. The employee will sign a release. And you know what the psychiatrist will say? I'm still not revealing it, but he's okay to work for you guys. We have to trust the psychiatrist. Not a smart idea, but that's the society we're in today. In the back, yes?
Hi there. Just wondering, when it comes to mice and the motivations for those who do betray what they've said they're going to do, just your personal perspective, are there any you find more understandable than others, or any that you find more forgivable than others? I'm not asking you to rank them necessarily, but obviously changing your mind for ideology is very different to changing it for money. I was just curious on your personal take.
Money, I completely understand. We all like it. I like it. Raise your hand here in the audience if you don't like money. I think that, I mean, and again, you know, living beyond your means. Like I said, I interviewed Ames in federal prison. Ames is unrepentant. And he said, I'd do it all over again. I like what I had. I interviewed him. He's unrepentant, but he didn't take a dime. He loved being a spy for the Cubans. Compromise, I kind of get. I mean, I don't rank them at all. I mean, Alger Hiss was a Harvard Law graduate. He was a good man. But when he joined the government in World War II at the direction of Felix Frankfurter, he just got seduced. He felt as though the communists were fighting the fascists, the communists were doing something, they were building a great economy, as so we thought, while we were mired in the Depression. He said, the communists, that's the answer. Let me help them. It'd be hard to do that. I could give it a thought. Any other follow-up? Okay,
We've got one over here.
sure.
Based on all of your cases that you worked on, what was the initial first encounter for all of them? Like, was it honey trap or chance encounters with their handlers?
I am going to say the ones I handle, they self-recruited. Some of the relationships started off totally innocent, and they were manipulated. Juanita worked with me in CI. She had to suffer with me for almost 14 years, poor thing. I'm surprised she showed up tonight, but thank you. And that it was hard to say. And the other ones just self-recruited. They just simply wanted to do this. And they found an initial point that, in Kendall's case, it was a chance encounter with a Cuban intelligence officer. And so when I go back and look at all this, a lot of this was, a good chunk of it was chance, and the manipulation occurred, and the weak or vulnerable or ego guy, very few women involved in this, from the State Department, got manipulated into doing it, and off they went. Yes?
Thank you. So I have a question about, so how do you think that counterintelligence is changing with technological advances and advances in hacking, as evidenced by the recent stories with China?
That's getting into a very sensitive issue, and if John Fitzsimmons would like to answer. No, John, I'm not going to ask you to do that. We use a lot of software these days in watching electronic communications. What was interesting in his case, that he transmitted all the information that he brought out of the State Department, and he brought it out of the State Department up here. He didn't come home with pieces of paper. He had a couple keywords. He'd come home from the office. His wife would open up the computer, and he would start rattling off all the information he'd memorized during the day. And as he told me, I had to learn to become a good memorizer. So he's got a few keywords written on pieces of paper. Had the guards stop them at the front gate of the State Department, all they'd have found a piece of paper with words on it. Writes it all down. She then goes to an internet cafe and sends it to their handler in Mexico, who then sends it on. There are massive amount of money being put into software and into cyber. But that's all I can really say about it. But that's where we're going. Absolutely. Good question.
I have a question.
Yes, Ted.
When you took it to that department where they're supposed to clear it, from the time they called you in till you actually got the okay, how long was it? Number two, did you have any impact on that office? Because it was obvious that they really didn't know what they were doing if they kept trying to truncate stuff that was already public knowledge, and how many other authors might have had their books truncated because they were not aware of what was the public domain and what wasn't.
It was over 2 years. From the time I turned it into Linda, I'd actually left Washington, D.C., and for those who remember, the last email that I sent from my office was a pretty nasty note to the Director of Diplomatic Security and about 15 other seniors saying, the worst I've ever been treated by an office in the State Department is the Bureau of Diplomatic Security's Office of FOIA. I found that what they did is simply not consistent with good work. And based off what I saw, public information is being redacted. Other things are being redacted, so I just don't think they have a base. And Linda acknowledged to me that my work was something they'd never come across before. And I think there's only 2 other DS agents that have actually published books, but it's not like this. It's more policy, fighting terrorism, things like that. This actually talked about State Department people, their lives, their personal stuff. And I think they felt very uncomfortable because I'm talking about US citizens, and I did have access to their personnel files, but the information in my book is publicly information. So a little bit, it was something new to them, so I think they had difficulty. I hope they do better now that they're reminded of what the rules are. And, and I think in the future, if anybody wants to write a book like this, what they need to do, they have to have a source with a draft manuscript. So when they cite these things, show where that information is public. Because I think they're more scared, Ted, to be honest with you. They would be afraid if something got out there that would embarrass the State Department or would cause harm. And that was not my intention. Anything else? Last call. Going once. Going, yes?
Hold on.
Wait a minute, hold on. Now, of all the people to ask this, yes, go ahead.
How did State Department act when some of the congressmen and senators would leak information that affected the State Department?
The State Department has no natural constituency. We don't have an Iowa. We don't have military bases in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We don't have Lockheed or Boeing. We are a standalone agency with the second smallest bureaucracy in the United States, and we depend on the largesse of Congress to fund us. We don't get into battles with Congress. Congress can leak what they want about the State Department. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to call the FBI up and say, we think there's been a deliberate compromise of State Department information. And when the FBI did investigate a certain senator because he leaked information, I think it was to CNN, about the terrorist tape, about the attack is tomorrow, and they eventually identified that Southern senator who leaked the information, it was then dropped and passed on to the Senate Ethics Committee, who decided that he had not deliberately leaked the information to CNN. Even the FBI knows you don't take on Congress on leaked information. Just not done. Going once? Yes?
Oh, no.
I know you guys think you can speak loud, but you really can't because everyone's got to hear the question. This is fine. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. During the Cold War, almost every agency within the IC was compromised by Russian intelligence services, except for the Coast Guard. So I was wondering if you had an opinion on what they did right.
I would disagree with you. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was not compromised by as much. They are the smallest government. Again, it comes to capabilities, intentions. If an intelligence service believes that a particular agency has information that they need, then they will target you. And I'm probably going to guess this, but because the Coast Guard, I know at that particular point, they were part of the Department of Transportation, not DOD, that they did not really come on the radar scope. And I'm also going to guess that the Coast Guard probably did cooperate probably with the Cubans on humanitarian issues, and they probably cooperated with the Russians off the Bering Sea. And so they're pretty open people. They save lives. They save Russian seamen that have an apodecty on their freighters. So they were kind of considered pretty much a friendly group of law enforcement. And they were considered more law enforcement. I know they did serve in Vietnam off the coast, but I don't think they really looked at them as auxiliary intelligence people. So that's why I think they were kind of let go. My opinion. Going once, going twice, sold. And I want to thank you all for coming out here tonight.
And we want to thank you